Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. My name is Sean Duffy. I'm the host of today's live stream. We have two guests with us today, as you can see, co-authors of a book called Above the Shots. It's about the Kent State shootings back in 1970. Gregory S. Wilson is an associate professor of history at the University of Akron, specializing in modern U.S. and Ohio and public history. Craig Simpson is now the Director of Special Collections and Archives at San Jose State University. Previously, he was a librarian at Kent State, where he managed the Kent State Shootings Oral History Project. So I'll let them take over now. Here is Greg and Craig.
All right. Craig, I'll start.
Okay, please.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Craig's on the West Coast. I'm in Ohio, so it's breakfast for Craig and lunch with me. Thanks for joining us, and Sean, thanks for the intro. We're happy to be part of this. Just a quick intro for us and all of you that are out there. I had been slated to do a couple of talks here in Ohio for the 50th anniversary of the Kent State shootings, and when coronavirus hit, those were shut down. The 50th anniversary celebrations, commemorations were all canceled in person. So it was going to be a very momentous occasion marking this anniversary of the shootings in 1970. So I was very happy when Sean made contact with me. I was able to get Craig, and so we were able to do a little bit of something that we might have done more of had the 50th anniversary has gone forward. So I'm glad we could do this for everybody out there. So I teach American history, modern American history. I also teach Ohio history. And for a long time, when I'm teaching at the University of Akron, I've been saying to my students and to myself, it'd be good if we had a good book on Kent State, especially one that was able to interview. And so lo and behold, one day I opened my email and there was a message from Craig, who was then at Kent, saying he was working on this project and he wanted me to talk with him and maybe join him. So I did, and the result of that email was our book, Above the Shots. So and that came on a few years ago. So that's kind of how it got started. Craig did a lot of the legwork initially with the project, which I'll turn over to him in a second. And then I jumped in to help shape the narrative. I did interviews myself, and together we were able to put this together. So it was a great pleasure working with Craig. It was really informative, engaging. It was moving to meet and talk with so many narrators who were there in May of 1970. And so I'm really looking forward to talking with all of you today about the book and whatever questions you have. So Craig, I'll turn it over to you.
Greg. Yeah, so as Greg said, I was the Special Collections Librarian at Kent State University between 2004 and 2010. And one of my duties, certainly not the only one, but the one that ultimately I found most rewarding, was to be the head of the Kent State Shootings Oral History Project, which I should add had started long before I was involved with it. It had originally started under a woman named Sandra Perlman Halem, who is, I don't know if she still is, but at the time she was the co-director of the Kent Historical Society. And Sandra and her team managed to collect several oral history interviews, mainly at the annual commemorations, particularly the big commemorations, the 1990, the 1995, and the 2000 commemorations. So when I started in 2004, 2005, the project had been dormant for a few years. And when I started, I wanted to take a different tack to it that ended up informing the book that Greg and I would put together a few years later, in that we didn't want to just focus on the commemorations, because as great and as powerful as those are, most of the interviewees that you're going to get are former students. So while we still wanted to get recollections from Kent State alumni, we also wanted to branch out. And so we were ultimately a bit more strategic, I think. We cast a wider net in also interviewing many faculty who were at Kent State, faculty and students who lived in the area, like at University of Akron. We also interviewed a couple of National Guardsmen who have been typically not very forthcoming about this topic. I managed to interview a couple of presidents of Kent State. And I should say the president at the time in 1970, Robert White, he passed away not long after that event. But I wound up interviewing President Michael Schwartz, who was president at KSU, I think the late 70s and early 80s, and then Carol Cartwright, who was president in the 90s and then the early aughts. And so when Greg and I ended up writing our book, we wrote it between 2010, 2015 roughly, and it came out in 2016. We wanted to tell a story about the shootings that was not exclusively focused on May 4, 1970. It wasn't going to be just on that day or on those couple of days. So we wound up in our book taking about a 30, 40 year, several different decades that showing the buildup in the decade prior to 1970 and a lot of the long-term causes of the shootings, as well as really the struggle for Kent State to survive, and then I think the struggle for its identity and how to memorialize and remember these events, which really happened immediately after the shootings. And I think that narrative still continues to this day. So that's just kind of the general overview of how we approach the book. And we can we can talk plenty more about it on our own. But if anyone has any questions off the bat, please feel free. And we'll take an awkward pause and see if there are
that's right.
any questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit, maybe just about some of the details, just about the events. And Craig, you can jump in here too.
Sure.
The way we structured the book was to kind of take us through step by step. So the book begins with a kind of a prequel, if you will, of looking at Kent State University prior to 1970. So how it developed into a large state university, its student culture. We looked at some of the political events that had been going on at Kent prior to 1970, and looking back at how those that attended Kent remembered that and reflected on what they saw as Kent's identity leading up to that point. And one of the things that struck us that we saw was that a lot of narrators had not different, maybe slightly different interpretations. A lot of people saw Kent as a in the middle of nowhere university, right? A big place with no identity, a place that one would not expect to see protests and radical behavior and students being shot. Others, though, looked more deeply at the history of the university and could see a development of a student protest of a radical dimension, which fed into the events of the 60s and then ultimately the protests in 1970. So we kind of looked at that, and then the book takes you then into the days of May. Essentially, the event that really sparks the immediate events was President Nixon's announcement of an invasion of Cambodia. This was April 30, 1970. And then the next days come, there's a protest against that invasion on campus, and an announcement then that there'd be a rally held Monday, May 4th, to decide whether or not the students would go on strike. And so there were a lot of protests across the country after Nixon's announcement, a lot of universities in Ohio. And then over the weekend, there was a series of events between students and what ultimately with the National Guard would be called in. There were violence and demonstrations on Friday night in downtown Kent. And then on Saturday, the big event on Saturday evening was when we had the ROTC fire, which burned down the old ROTC building. And then Sunday night, major sit-in downtown Kent. Students were demanding to speak with President White. They were demanding that the National Guard be off campus. And so what had started as an anti-Vietnam, anti-war movement, a demonstration, still was that, but then it morphed into a demonstration against the Guard's presence on campus. So those two things really came together. And our narrators talk a lot about that change, about the climate that on those evenings, the tension, the rumors that were spreading around at that moment about what was happening, what they thought might happen. And then we get into the events of Monday, May 4, the day of the shootings, and our narrators are very vivid and very emotional, talking about what they remember. The major controversies of that day, was there a plan to shoot students? Was it spontaneous? Were there a lot of rocks thrown back and forth? Did the Guard turn in unison? Why did they shoot where they shot? All of these different events that are still part of this story. And our narrators were really vivid and emotional talking about that. We were able to interview a couple National Guardsmen, or at least one. Most of the National Guardsmen were not part of the oral history. There were some anonymous ones done as part of the Kent Oral History Project. Craig can talk about that. And then the book takes us into the aftermath. So what happened immediately after the shootings on campus? What was it like? Campus was shut down. Students were sent home. We have some really vivid memories of narrators who were wounded going to the hospital, vivid memories of students who were in the parking lot when the bullets started coming, being next to at least one of the students who was ultimately shot and killed. And then we have narrators talking about sort of the aftermath in Kent and when they went home and the reaction to the shootings. And then we take the book into the years after, the legal challenges that went forward. There were lawsuits, civil lawsuits, criminal trials against the Guard. Eventually, the lawsuit was settled in 1979. And then we also look at the university. How has the university tried to come to terms with what happened? As Craig mentioned, President White, President Cartwright, others beginning to shift the focus from trying to not have anything to do with the shootings, to forget them essentially as a university, to now the university has a museum, they're a National Historic Site, and it's become a place of studying not only the shootings, but the 60s generally, but also big questions about free speech, demonstration, First Amendment, civil and state authority, lots of big issues that the shootings really showed. And so we really tried to tell the story of not only the shootings, but what happened afterwards and where we are now, at least in the late 2000 teens, I guess, with this event and what it has meant. So, Craig, I don't know if you have anything, or if we've got some questions. I haven't been paying attention. So
I don't see any yet.
Okay,
but please, we'll just keep talking. We could talk for days on this topic.
Yeah.
But we want, if you have any questions, just feel free. We're happy to stop and engage with those. Kind of where you left off, Greg. I think our book leaves off roughly around 2015 or so. I mean, it kind of ends. I think two of the last topics that we cover are the creation of the May 4 Visitor Center. And it's been a while since I read our book, so correct me if I'm wrong. But the May 4 Visitor Center, and then I think the Ohio Historical Marker as well, which I was involved in the latter, in the sense of that was a faculty-led initiative at Kent. Well, in fact, Laura Davis and the late Carol Barbado who also were the co-founders of the Visitor Center, were involved in that as well. And I was involved in this just in the sense of scanning images for their proposal. But excuse me, that was a really, I think, good that was a good place to end it, because I feel like there's this really long, extraordinary narrative about the Kent State shootings that I think gets lost because of the focus on what happened on May 4, 1970. And I certainly understand the interest in that focus. Greg and I are I sort of, call us the second generation of Kent State authors, because I was born in 1970, and Greg, I think, around the same time too. So we don't have memories of the shootings the way a lot of the original kind of first generation authors did. So, and I think that's reflected in the book. I think it does allow. I think it's a blind spot in some sense, in that we can't. There's no way that I can feel the emotional impact as powerful as it is listening to many of these narrators. I can't feel the same impact because I wasn't there, but at the same time, I also feel that it allows us maybe a degree of distance that gave us that really kind of gave the book its wider scope. And one of the reasons I should mention too, although in a way I should say in some ways I was too close to the topic as well, because I had interviewed maybe 40 narrators between 2004 and 2010. There are about 100, there are maybe close to 150 narrators overall in the project. So many of those, I think there were about 70 that were conducted before I started. And then there have been, of course, some that have been conducted since I left Kent in 2010. But I think what made Greg's contribution so invaluable was, and you can kind of talk about this if you want to, Greg, but the fact that you were an historian and interested in memory studies and regional history, I think helped, particularly I think in the talking about Kent in the 1960s, right? Because there are sort of a lot of myths that you touched upon that came out of James Michener's book and so forth, where a lot of people wondered or projected this idea that Kent State was this sort of idyllic campus, and there were no protests or anything like that was happening, and that the shootings came out of the blue. When in fact, I think through a lot of your research, and then also our friend Tom Grace, who was one of the wounded students, who we drew at least some of our research from. A lot of your research shows that wasn't the case, right?
Yeah. And then we've got a couple questions here. I'll try to answer those. Yeah, you're right.
Sure.
No, that's good. Yeah, it's, again, that's one of the things I think I was looking back, part one of the book, and we drew our quotes from our narrators. Part one of the book is the largest unknown university in the world, right? That's how some thought of Kent. But in fact, there was a lot of activism going back, even to the 50s. And Tom Grace, his book on Kent really digs deep into that whole story. So by the time you get to 1970, there had been quite a bit of activism, not just about Vietnam. There was activism on the part of Black students on Kent's campus as well. Black United students was active in those ways. So there was a good deal of that already, and then the war and then the Guard coming just sort of amplified what was there and began to draw a lot of students into wanting to demonstrate. So there was a core group of activists, but then there were a lot of students who just were drawn into the anti-war stance, the anti-war movement, who might not have been sort of core activists, but were there, attending rallies, watching what was happening, paying attention to things. So, so we have a group of kind of core students, but then you have this kind of next layer out, you might say, right, of students who were against the war, following the events, but weren't considered to be the core group, who were members of, say, the Students for Democratic Society, SDS, or the Young Socialists, or other radical groups that were on campus. So, and so there was a lot of that at Kent. Ohio State was active as well. Some at Akron, not as much, but there. So there was a presence. So it wasn't as if it came out of nowhere. So, but a couple questions. And I think there's one at the end, and I know, Craig, you might want to talk about this too. There's a question about differences, right, in the narratives that we did between, say, faculty, students, faculty, National Guard. So, as I said about the students, I think there was a lot of the stuff that we found, and Craig had done a lot of this, was to look at students who, again, who weren't necessarily core activists, but who were there observing, and how they saw not just the events, but what they were beginning to understand, the meaning and importance of those events. So for the activists, there's a division there between those that really would see this event, it's still 50 years later, as a political event. This was from a more radical perspective, socialists, SDS members, that this was a political act against the state, against the Guard, a political act against the war, and still feel strongly and want to have it remembered that way. There are others who took a slightly different stance now, years later, that have evolved into looking at this as a way to understand a peaceful demonstration, First Amendment, and trying to sort of broaden what the meaning of this event was: reconciliation, understanding, and peace. And so there's a division within the students who were more active. At least that came through in the memories, the interviews we did. And then you have students who were there. Again, there was probably, estimates are hard to pin down, but we say about maybe 1,000 to 2,000 students, right, who were there on May 4 to be part of a rally against the Guard, against the war. And then you had, you know, the other thousands of students who were there. Remember, too, campus was open. That's one of the controversial points about this. There were calls to shut down campus, but President White kept campus open. Governor Rhodes, James Rhodes was governor then, he urged them to stay open, not let campus be shut down by the radicals, etc. So campus was open, classes were being held, students were going back and forth. It was midterm week, so there was a lot of just basic activity you'd find on a campus at noon, at lunchtime. So we have a lot of narrators who were there, just observing, watching, you know, whether they were just going to class or whether they were there for the demonstration, the protest that was held on May 4. And then, yeah, we have a lot of different faculty perspectives too, and guardsmen. So, Craig, you want to talk about the faculty, maybe? Or
sure. Well, I mean,
whatever you want.
I think it's a great question, because I think one of the things we discovered was, I mean, you could definitely sort of collect the interviews together and say, overall, the students felt this way and the town's people felt a different way. But I do feel in our interviews what really interested me and surprised me a little was, like Greg said, there is some diversity, I think, even in some of the opinions of within those different demographics. I think, and I don't know if that just kind of resulted because we were interested in diversity and kind of sort of deliberately looking for that. But I think, you know, among the students, like Greg said, there were some that were radical to begin with. There were others, like one of the most powerful, and my longest interview was with Chuck Ayers, the cartoonist, who gave us a phenomenal 2.5-hour interview. And I think he reflected kind of what a lot of the students felt, where he was against the war. He was not, like, he described himself as maybe not overtly radical until the Guard came on campus. And then I think, like many students, he was just personally affronted by their presence. And so that really kind of made him and many students radical on the spot. I think many of the faculty, like Dr. Jerry Lewis, he talked about, Professor Lewis was a faculty marshal. He tried to, like many younger faculty at Kent State, he was definitely more sympathetic toward the students. He was very much against the Vietnam War. He, at the same time, he tried to mediate, I think, better communications. He was, Greg, I think Jerry talked about, he was part of this rumor control center that he said right. Spread more rumors than it controlled.
Right, yes.
Yeah, so I think that was really interesting. The National Guardsmen, now we interviewed 2 guardsmen, and I should add, neither of them were any of the guardsmen that actually opened fire. One of them was a captain for another company that was on the other side of was kind of on the other side of the building, the School for Journalism, that they came around after the shootings happened. And then another guardsman was, he told me he was essentially in charge of guarding a latrine off campus. And so he heard the news about it much later. But they gave, both of those 2, I thought, gave really compelling different perspectives from the Guard. You had one who I think was sort of very dedicated, I think took a very kind of traditionally right-wing stance. But both of them were at the Teamster riots that had happened shortly before this, where they were being shot at by Teamsters. They were in charge of protecting trucks during a Teamster strike. And then they were both also at the Akron riots, I think. Was that the year before, Greg, in 69?
68, yeah.
68, yeah. They were both there too. And what the first one, the first guardsman that we interviewed talked about, he kind of said that there were no problems or no differences between the Kent State event and the Akron riots, whereas the other guardsman, he wanted really no part in anything, and he said there was a big difference between the more urban riots that happened in Akron and then the riots, as opposed to the event on the Kent State campus. So we tried in our narrative, the big challenge was kind of bringing all of these voices together, while also trying to find a place for our own kind of collective voice, if you will. That's why we start the book with 2 separate introductions. It's the only time where I think Greg and I sort of speak as ourselves individually rather than a collective authorship. But it was a challenge to, I think, bring all these voices together. I think it took us a while to figure it out, but I'm pleased with how it came out, and that I think the variety and the complexity of these perspectives really kind of, I wanted a sort of an ensemble cast, if you will, kind of a kaleidoscopic type of book that would reflect these things, and I'm pretty pleased with how it came out.
Yeah, no, that's a good point about the faculty too. The other interesting thing about the interviews with the faculty is there were some who were in class at the time, right, and and then kept class going or canceled class when the rally began. We interviewed a couple of or had been interviewed. I don't think we talked to them, but these were interviews done prior to when Craig and I got involved, and some were talking about really negative views of the students, the demonstrations. This is a more conservative perspective. There was some of those voices came through in the oral histories that were collected, and they're in the book as well. And then, as Craig said, there's the more sympathetic view from folks like Professor Lewis and others. So again, you get a real perspective, and I think why that was important for us in terms of looking back on this event was to try to understand what one narrator called the Great Divide in the country, not just then, but now. And there's a question about kind of how does Kent, reflect or help us understand what's going on now. That was something that, as a historian, I was trying to puzzle through and still interested in, is understanding what those divisions were in the 60s between sort of left liberal or liberal mainstream politics. Again, to remember back in the 50s and 60s, liberalism was really at the center of American politics then. And then the division between that and a more left, often student-driven new left from the SDS and others, and then also the emergence of what became the right, the conservative response to the events of the 60s. And so the book, I think, tries to do that in a small way, to see those different voices and how the Kent state shootings encapsulated those divisions through oral history. And then how that has continued into the present, how these narrators are thinking back on May 1970 and what impact that has had on the country since. So that was another, to me, a really interesting part about what we were trying to do with the book as well.
Yeah.
And so, that question earlier, I think Sean or others might have asked that, what parallels do we see between sort of May 1970 and there it is, May 1970 and events today. And Craig, there's one really powerful one in there. I think we had somebody who was both at the May 4 and then later at the Giffords shooting.
Oh, right.
Randy Gardner, I think, is in there. So do you want to talk about, that's just one parallel, but maybe we can talk in general.
Yeah, it's strange too, because when we were writing the book, we were in the Obama era. And now, and now we're in of course the Trump era, and I mean where to start? There are a ton of things that I think really come to mind. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the issue of political activism, I think, and I'm struck. I work at San Jose State, and we just commemorated the 50th anniversary of the two former San Jose State runners, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who at the 1968 Olympics did the Black Power salute, and what caused a bunch of controversy. And then it's interesting now because they caused a ton of controversy. They were both just branded pariahs for a long time, but then now 50 plus years later, they're hailed as heroes, right? And there's statues of them and everything. While at the same time, Colin Kaepernick in the Bay Area at the same time was doing his form of a protest, and then he got also severely criticized and booted out of the NFL for that too. So when I thought about that with the protesters at the time in 1970 to how they're looked at today, again, I feel like we tend to, one thing that kind of comes through, I think, from our book, from researching and writing it, is for some reason, we tend to kind of romanticize protests when there's some distance, but whereas at the time, though, it's often kind of unpopular. Having said that, I do feel there has been a recent change, though, I think, with the Black Lives Matter protests. This is really kind of the first, to me at least, feels like a really significant shift in how protest and activism are regarded on the whole, compared to how it was in 1970. Because, back after the 4 students were killed and the 11 were wounded, a lot of people in the town of Kent and otherwise were saying, well, they should have shot more of them, and there was a very unsympathetic, hostile attitude toward that. And I mean, I think there's obviously some pockets of that now, but I kind of feel like it's a little bit different now, and I think there's a variety of reasons for that. I think another interesting thing, I think about my interview with Ken Hammond, who was a former member of SDS, and this is a whole nother story that would take too long to get into, but he was eventually indicted and the charges were dropped for his role in the shootings. But he talked about how when he was a student, that a lot of activism was more consolidated, that a lot of these different issues were sort of consolidated together a little bit more. And then I think he kind of talked about in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that it seemed to kind of split up these different issues into factions, right? So you have environmentalists, you have, anti-war, and then kind of a lot of these separate things. But I think, I don't know, I'd be interested to interview him again now, because it almost feels like it's kind of coming back to what Kent talked about. I feel like Black Lives Matter really encompasses a lot of these different things, right? It definitely the issue of gun control and a lot of these different topics. Although there's obviously a distinctive topic running through Black Lives Matter, that a lot of these it seems to be broader than it has been maybe in recent years.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, just to build on that too, on the same issue. I think there's a few kind of big questions I think we mentioned earlier that Kent shows us. One is, to what extent do we protect free speech? First Amendment. What does democracy mean, right? What are we willing to accept? And then what power does the government, does the state have? And how does it choose to use that power? So in the Kent State shootings, that was a key issue, right? Were students, using their First Amendment free speech rights to assemble, to protest the war? What role did the government, federal, state, local government, have in that? Why was the Guard mobilized? Were they authorized to use force, right, military force against students who were protesting the war? And those same big questions come up at many times. One of the things we wrote about in the book was, at the time, was the Occupy Wall Street movement that was going on, and there were demonstrations, across the country on campuses, and police were acting in very similar ways. Some were supportive, others. There's a famous case where I think it was it UC Santa Barbara, where the police officer was using pepper spray on students who were kneeling, in sympathy with the Occupy movement. And then again, we see the same kinds of images that we saw in the 60s, where police are with protesters in the streets, right? Some are acting peacefully, others there's violence. What power does the state have? Can they act with impunity? Can they be contained in some way? All of those big questions we're asking now are the same things we asked in 1970 and in the 60s more generally. So I do see a lot of parallels between those types of issues and questions between these two eras. So yeah.
Yeah. Right. Well, what direction should we take?
Yes, I muted myself. I hope it's working. It looks like some folks
I
are
see some people are having some technical difficulties
accessing it. So maybe that's been solved. So good. Yeah. One of the looks like maybe it is. Yeah. One of the things too that we talk about in the book is, again, how the events are being remembered on campus and elsewhere. So I think the campus, the university, has been much more open now to accepting the shootings, but at the same time, there's division over how the university is, you might say, creating a narrative, right, about the shootings. What were they about? What lessons do we draw from them? And again, that goes back to I think the political divide that's still there. One of the big controversies that came about was over, first of all, whether there should be a memorial on campus or not, right? Does the university want to acknowledge what happened? And if so, how? And that was a big point of tension, I think, for probably almost 20 years, not quite 20 years. And the first, the major memorial that came out prior to having a visitor center now was the Bruno Ast Memorial that's on campus today. You can go see it near Taylor Hall. And that memorial was to be much larger. It ended up being much smaller. They had trouble raising money for it. And when it came out, it seemed too abstract. It didn't seem to acknowledge directly the shootings, the 4 who were killed, the wounded students. And so later they added words and signage to it to make it more direct. This is a memorial about students who were shot, who were killed, who were wounded, and this is what it was about. So even now with the visitor center, there's still some of that, right? Well, how direct are we talking? What is the political message you're sending? Is this just about peace and reconciliation, or is this a much more volatile thing that we want to talk about in terms of the politics of what this was? And so you'll see that in the comments there. You'll see it among visitors. What is it we're supposed to get from this? So that's still out there. Still a lot of that tension, even on campus, even with the visitor center. How are we remembering this event, but also how are we remembering the 60s era more generally? So,
Yeah, and that ties into this question: how is the massacre commemorated?
Oh, good. Yeah,
on
go
the
ahead.
site and on campus. So I'll kind of continue to pick up on that question. Yeah. So there has been since the beginning, and by the beginning I mean 1971. There's an annual commemoration on the campus, and particularly there, and then for the years that end in 5 and 0. There are those commemorations tend to be larger in scope, and the memorials typically go. They've evolved, they've changed over the decades, but I think one thing from the beginning has been they've tended to go over those 2 or 3 days. There's always a candlelight vigil, I believe, the evening of May 3rd. And then kind of continuing into May 4. I can't remember exactly when the 4 markers that mark the 4 dead students, Jeffrey Miller, Ellison Krause, Sandy Sawyer, and Bill Schroeder, in the parking lot, and then over there on the lawn. But those markers have been there for a while. There's usually I believe they have individuals during the candlelight vigil and kind of over that evening who will take turns kind of standing in or near those markers. Now, again, like Greg said, the university for many, many years was very uneasy about any kind of memorial. A lot of controversy. The memorial design competition, I should add that Bruno Ast design, the one that you see out there now, not only is that maybe a third of his original design, he actually did not win the contest. It was originally won by a man named Ian Taberner, who, in a very kind of embarrassing public debacle, it was revealed after it was announced he won that he was Canadian, which was in violation of the rules of the contest. So following that, then the runner-up design was Bruno asked which one. So there was that for a long time. It wasn't really until Carol Cartwright became president of Kent State that I think that we started to see a shift in the university in how it regarded itself. There was even a period when I interviewed her, she talked about how there was a branding effort being done to change Kent State to just like Kent University. You could even see it in some stationery and logos and things like that at the time. She even saw at a basketball game once, she saw Kent up on the scoreboard, and she went up to the scoreboard person and said, "We're Kent State, change it." So she really, I think, embraced the history of the university much more than any KSU president had before her. She was the first KSU president to participate in the Candlelight Vigil, which must have been sometime in the 1990s. And that was a very unpopular decision. But Carol Cartwright did that. And then after her, I think in the 10, 15 years since then, we've had, like I said, the Ohio Historic Landmark. We had the Mayflower Visitor Center, which is extraordinary, by the way. Once this pandemic ends, I encourage everyone who can to go, because it's, I think, a really powerful experience going through that exhibition. But also there was the National Landmark as well too, right? It's a national historic landmark now, I believe, as well. So there is I think some cynicism, perhaps, to the attitude of the university, kind of using it as sort of like almost like, I think, kind of a marketing PR tool. But overall, I have to say, if you want to talk about, I think, the importance of visibility, I think that a lot of these things have provided, if not total closure, the sense that I get from a lot of students, eyewitnesses who were there at the time and who have some really traumatic memories of this. It seems to be on the whole a much more positive thing. But I should add too, it was really a lot of those individuals. It was the May 4 task force who really worked to keep the memory alive. Again, I've been doing some research comparing this event to San Jose State, and there is a statue on the San Jose State campus of Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising their fists at the Olympics. That statue was funded by the students. And that statue's been there a lot longer than anything at Kent State. So there wasn't really any administrative pushback on it, but that was a student and a faculty driven initiative. And it's really been the students, the alumni, the faculty, and not just students at the time, but a lot of the subsequent generations at Kent, who I think have been very, very active and very essential in the memory of this event, which again, in our book, the shootings happen about halfway through our book. So there's the rest of the book, there is a substantial portion of it that deals into the memory of it, because I think we found it important, we found it interesting. And again, I think we took our cue from a lot of the people who were interviewed. I think we narrowed our interviews down to maybe 50 or 60 voices. So it's not every interview is in there. If you want to listen to more of the narrators, you can go on just Google Kent State shootings, and you can listen and read the full transcripts of all of those interviews. But we tried to take about 50 or 60 of them, and many of them, again, I thought it was really amazing the breadth of their memories, because so many of them really go through the last 4 or 5 decades. And like I said, in our book, we tried to reflect that.
Yeah, that's a good point. On campus now, if you went to visit, you can look online and see it virtually. But there's the May 4 Visitor Center, and what that Visitor Center does, it's in Taylor Hall, and Taylor Hall is the journalism building. It's the building you see whenever you look at an image from the Kent State, events on May 4. You'll see Taylor Hall there. That's where around near there where the shootings happened, where the tear gas went. So it's in Taylor Hall, and it's basically a three-section visitor center. So you walk in, the first section of the visitor center gives you the context of the 60s. So the civil rights movement is in there, anti-war movement, the counterculture, right? It kind of sets the mood, if you will, for what was happening in the country and on Kent's campus, circa 1970. And there's a lot of personal mementos that were donated to the museum. For example, Polaroid, the famous Polaroid pictures of the era of, them, students, parents, others, at that moment, living in Kent, being on campus, a lot of clothing, hats, etc. There's one of the hats that I think it was Sandy Sawyer's hat, if I'm remembering right, or Alison Krause's hat is there. And then as you walk around the corner, you come into the 4 days in May. So it takes you right into those 4 days. What happened, as we said, on campus and in Kent, May 1st, 2nd, 3rd. And then there's a short film, a very powerful film that gives you what was going on for those several minutes there. Once when the guard was marching, they walked back up the hill they had marched down, and then the portion of the guard turned in unison and started firing their M1 rifles in a triangular field back into the students, and that's powerfully done. And then the immediate aftermath, and then you kind of come out of the film, and you come into kind of the immediate year afterwards, and then sort of to today. So again, they try to take you through that landscape that way. There's signs around campus now. You can walk around and see where the guard stood, where the shooting happened. There's, as Craig said, in the Prentice Hall, there were 2 buildings, Taylor Hall and then Prentice Hall. In the Prentice Hall parking lot, where the 4 students who were killed there are now markers there. So those are cordoned off inside, but it's still a parking lot, right? You can still pull in and park, which is kind of, I found a little disconcerting to me, but that was controversial even, right? It's a parking lot. Students need parking. Why are you bothering with this? So, but they are marked off now. And when the annual vigil happens, you'll have people standing at each spot, all night there rotating. So, and so you can at least see and interpret the events that way now in a way that you couldn't, right, till recently. So,
and there's a not a question, but it's a comment about that references Sandy Sawyer, and I think it was kind of outside of the scope of our book in talking about the 4 students who were killed, but one individual I interviewed, whose name was Ellis Burns, was with Sandy Sawyer. They were friends. And he was standing right next to her in the parking lot when she was shot and killed. And that was a very, that was a very powerful and emotional interview, and in hearing his story. And I think I believe there is I would need to check. I think there is or was a recent virtual exhibition, and I can't remember if it's the May 4 Visitor Center or if it was KSU Special Collections and Archives, but there was or is an exhibition specifically on Sandy Sawyer, Alison Krause, Bill Schroeder, Jeffrey Miller, where I was glad when I saw that, because there seems to be also a movement to humanize them, and because they're icons, right? they're icons and they're martyrs, and those are significant things. But I think it's also important to really show their humanity, that they were all students. They were each students with their living their own lives and having their own aspirations and dreams. And Sandy and Jeff Miller, I believe, knew each other as well. There's some, I believe, in the visitor center and or the archives, I believe there's even some artwork that they did. There's poetry,
Yep.
and things like that. And I think that's very important too. And again, our book had kind of different objectives, but there's so much. I think that's an example of, with our book, we call it an oral history of the Kent State shootings, not the oral history. And I think what we wanted to do, one of our goals was to open up this topic a bit, because there's been some excellent work on it, but I think in some respects it's been shut down a little by some of the literature as well. And we wanted to, I think, open it up again. And I think there's all kinds of different avenues and directions that can be explored. And I think certainly the four students who were killed that day is one of them.
Yeah, the May 4 Visitor Center did, as you said, there's a separate section now. They've added a separate room, actually. So now there's 4. I said 3, there's 4. They have, and in that special area, they did a whole exhibit, as Craig said, on each of the 4 students who were killed. And I think that's an important part to remember about the humanity of all this. And that, to me, the value of oral history, one of the values is to recognize that humanity, right? To bring the voice of people, right? Individuals who make history, who live history, who experience history into a historical narrative that can be often abstract. We look at text documents, let's say, paper, but having the ability to bring the human voice into the story, into the narrative, to me is really fascinating. And I think that was an important part that I'm glad we were able to do that with the book. And as Craig said, and for an even more powerful, I think, experience, if you're able to access the Kent State Oral History Project on Kent State's website, many of these interviews that are in the book are transcribed there, but they're also audio. So you can hear, as Craig said, the emotion, the feeling, the power that comes through when they remember back, 40 or 50 years later, however many years it was when they did the interview. And I think Ellis Burns is one of those. There's others too that are very powerful that way. And when we interviewed them, as 2 human beings connecting, right, in an interview, we could feel that. We could be making that source through the oral history. And that's a unique thing that you can do with oral history. We create that source together, right? The narrator and the interviewer create a source that can be used in your work. That's not something that other sources can do. And so I think for this story in particular, being able to access that humanity, to me, is a really powerful thing, which I'm hoping you're all able to do if you're watching and listening to this later, is do that. I think we only have a couple of minutes left. I don't know if there's any final questions or not, so see if we have any. I'm not seeing any on the chat, so Sean's coming back. There he is.
I'm going to jump back in. Thank you both for an excellent presentation. The book is available at Kent State University Press, Amazon, and other outlets, typical outlets. And I just wanted to mention that next week we'll be exploring the Italian-American collection at Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh with Melissa Marinaro, who's promised to connect it to Wheeling, because we had a lot of Italian immigration to Wheeling. So that's next week at noon. And this Thursday, we're going to Australia for Around the World in Literature and Language with Brad Fitzmaurice, who is a Wheeling scholar. Thank you, gentlemen. And thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah.
Have a good day.
Yeah, good to see you, Greg. Let's do it again.